As far as I'm concerned, there's no better place to come to look for international trade than a port. Dublin Port, to be precise. It's got it all. Ships arriving and leaving, being loaded and unloaded, containers, cranes, the whole shebang. When I'm down here at the dockside, trade feels very tangible, all rectangular and boxy. We send you some of our stuff, you send us some of yours. It's a process that's underpinned by international agreements and the general assumption that trade is good for the economy.
When you're talking to trade negotiators, I used to be one, there's a focus on opening up markets for exports, and so there's always this sense of a quid pro quo. We'll give you some market access if you open your markets, and so you can get to this sense of someone's going to walk out of this winning or losing.
Loads of containers filled with consumer goods, great news for shoppers. But does all of this stuff coming in from abroad make it difficult for local companies to compete? And does cheap necessarily mean good?
If there's a market for a poor quality TV set in the United States, then so be it. And the market will determine whether in fact that survives or not. There's also the question of selling goods in the United States below cost, this issue of dumping, which is seen as being unfair to domestic industry.
Dumping, of course, nobody wants that, and a lot of people are very anti-free trade at the moment as a result. In fact, there's calls for protectionist policies.
One proposal which you hear is about reconstructing tariffs, building more obstacles to international trade and investment. And the question is whether that would return these industrialized countries and the industrialized sectors back to their former vigor, and I think it's probably not the case.
For someone who gets as excited about trade and containers as I clearly do, in fact I can hardly contain myself, I find it hard to understand why anyone would want to restrict trade, but it is in vogue now. In fact, politicians are full of talk about trade restriction.
We've seen, certainly in the presidential debates in the United States, for instance, I think to some extent we see it with what was happening with Brexit in the UK. We see in some of the debates in the continent, in Europe, increasing voices for more protectionism, for closing off economies, for turning away from globalization and trade.
Structure of global trade has changed, and there has been trade liberalization around the world, and therefore any move to return to an era of protection is going to lead to lots of unpredictable scenarios of retaliation.
If Donald Trump gets elected, and take him at his word, I think we're potentially in for a very significant period of protectionism, potential trade wars, and a deterioration in US and global economic growth.
So in these choppy and probably murky waters of international trade, negotiators are going to have to balance a number of conflicting interests. There's national self-interest, there's politicians arguing for protectionist policies, and at the same time, there's the interests of global growth. One way or another, though, we are all in the same boat.